I don't typically do data mine videos this early, so when I say that I'm very excited about the Marvel Rivals season to the point that I am doing this data mine right now, you know that's true just from the fact that this video even exists. It seems as though the Marvel Rivals season was kept pretty heavily under wraps, with the data miners only getting access to it on Tuesday. This is normally far different. Data miners typically have these seasons multiple months in advance, but in this case, December season, which is this Rivals season, has only been data mined with a few weeks to go. So let's talk about all the cards in the December season and see if they end up stacking up to what we currently have in the metagame. The Season Pass card, according to data miners, is Galacta, Daughter of Galactus, a 4/6 with the ability to give the next card you play at different locations +3 power. The number one thing that comes to mind when I look at this card is that, oh, it's similar to Gwenpool. Much like Gwenpool, this is a Season Pass card that is a 4/6 that starts with the letter G and gives power to units you play after it. The question will be, how much of a difference will this 3 power make compared to Gwenpool's buffs to hand? Obviously, this is probably not impacting a card like Mysterio the way that we would want it to. Normally, when you forge a Mysterio, it only really hits the first of the 3 Mysterios. This is contrasted to the way that Galacta works with Mysterio. A hand buff onto Mysterio hits all 3. The real question I have for how this card is going to work is, will it work with Brood? The timing on this is going to matter a lot. Cards like Nico Minoru and Aranya typically don't work with Brood, while cards like Forge typically do. This is because of the timing windows in which they interact. If Galacta does work with Brood, this is suddenly a fairly interesting card to me. Obviously, a 15 power Brood is definitely something that you are excited about getting. Pairing a Brood in one lane with a Sebastian Shaw that effectively turns this buff into +5 can be really powerful if you're able to make this happen. This feels like a card that could be important in Silver Surfer. It's also a card that's just kind of a generically good stat stick, and I can see that being the role that this card falls into. We see Gwenpool, for example, in plenty of decks that don't really involve Brood, although most Gwenpool decks tend to involve Mysterio, but she doesn't even have to be that for those. Like, this is a card that could very easily end up in, like, a Dracula dump deck, maybe. This is a card that could very easily end up in an RSM deck, maybe. It's just good stats on curve, good stats on rate, and a very powerful card that should be the kind of card that can end up in a variety of spots. The question is going to be, will it be able to beat out its competition? Gwenpool is already fairly stiff competition if you're looking specifically at the niche of 4-drop card that buffs your later cards and is a 4/6 and is a Season Pass card that is a girl who starts with G. So, like, right there's some baseline competition. And that's not even to get into the more general competition of, like, there are not often a lot of spots for 4-drop cards in decks. Is this going to be worth it? Would a deck like, say, Scream want to be playing this as a 4 and then Arrow Magneto as 5/6? Is that what that deck wants to be doing? Can this go in generic mid-range decks? The upsides this has over Gwenpool is that it's always hitting what you actually play. The downsides are that it doesn't necessarily have the same surprise factor, and it doesn't have the same incredible synergy with Mysterio and maybe with Brood. We will have to see what actually ends up happening here, but baseline, this feels like a strong card in a very competitive niche, and what will make it stand apart is if it is able to break out from the pack at that niche. Next up is Luna Snow, a 3/5, already a pretty juiced stat line that adds an ice cube to both your and your opponent's side of this location. Ice Cube is a rapper, most famous for his work with NWA, but several of his later solo albums are definitely worth checking out. I'm sorry, I mean, Ice Cube is a 1/0 with the ability to add energy to your side of the board. Luna Snow creates 2 of these, so you get extra energy and your opponent gets extra energy. One note about Ice Cube is that when this location is filled up, it will get destroyed. So the person playing Luna Snow is actually maybe a little bit at a disadvantage. They play Luna Snow, they also get an Ice Cube, only 2 more spots left there, and as soon as those 2 spots are filled up, the Ice Cube goes away. To me, this makes Luna Snow kind of a fascinating combination of Wiccan and Wave. On the one hand, she's a little bit less all or nothing than Wave is, and on the other hand, she's a little bit less guaranteed to be good for you than Wiccan is. Obviously, because the effect is symmetrical, your opponent might actually be able to use it about as well as you can. The premise of this deck is that, or the premise of this card is that whatever deck you put it in is going to be doing better stuff with that energy than your opponent because you will be built for it and they will not be. The question is how true that can actually be in practice. That's a good theory, but in practice, any deck with a bit of a heavy curve will be able to use your opponent's Luna Snow about as well as they will be. So the real question is going to be, is this card going to make a big difference? And I think they know that from the fact that it has a 3/5 stat line. The Wave comparison seems pretty apt to me. This is a card that is symmetrical ramp and compares fairly prominently to Wave, which is symmetrical ramp, but it is continuous symmetrical ramp where Wave is a one-shot. So that means that there are multiple chances that you have to take advantage of this, which means it can be a little more useful than people may think. I do wonder about the sort of amount of just sort of good stat ramp cards that we have right now. Coming from a world where Electro used to be a 3/2 for 2 years, we now have this as a 3/5, we have Wiccan as a 4/7. There might just be like a deck that plays a bunch of good stat ramp cards and wants to feel good about doing that and then just dumps big expensive stuff at the end of the game. That seems entirely plausible with this card. What I think is more likely is that her deck building ends up looking a lot like Wiccan deck building, but with a little bit less restrictions and maybe actually some overlap. As a 3/5 that sort of accelerates you immediately into turn 4 playing 5 drops, right? Like that's just a good thing to do. Turn 5 playing 6 drops, turn 6 playing 6 drops. It's got the same sort of general curve as Electro. And I'm interested to see what that could actually create. I'm also interested in the sort of pseudo clog aspect of this card. If you clog up your opponent, they lose their bonus energy. That could also be a relevant way for this card to be an impactful and interesting thing. The odd bit about that, though, is that most cards that clog your opponent also kind of clog you first. So, for example, you have like a Green Goblin Titania play. If you put that in your Luna Snow lane, you're losing your Ice Cube as well. Another card that I think could be really powerful with this is Red Guardian. Red Guardianing away your opponent's Ice Cube while keeping yours seems like a really good way to be ahead for an extended period of time. And that seems like a really good way to start winning games. You give your opponent an Ice Cube that ends up sitting at -2, whereas you get extra energy the entire rest of the game. Next up is Dr. Doom 2099. He is a 4/2 with an ability that says, for the rest of the game, whenever you play only one card on a turn, exactly one card on a turn, you make a Doombot 2099. A Doombot 2099 is a 4/2 with an ability that gives your other Doombots and Doom an additional +1 power. So gaming this out, let's say you have 3 of these by the end of the game, one from turn 4, 5, and 6, all your other Dooms and Doombots will have an additional +3 power. Now, for the record, the way this actually reads, each one will not affect itself. So if you have 3 of them, what you'll have is 3 4/4s. They'll have 4 energy, 4 power, because each of them will be being affected by 2 others. And your original Doom 2099 will be a 4/5. It'll have 5 power because it'll be being hit by all 3 of these Doombots. Here's the thing, though. You can also play the card Dr. Doom. And so what this does is effectively say, now your Dr. Doom is 24 power. As someone who's been asking for extended buffs to Dr. Doom recently, this is more than I could have asked for. I think Doom 2099 is a genuinely elite card that has a lot of power potential. The real question is, how will this card fit in a metagame? Because I think we've clearly established, at least to me, that this is the kind of card that is worth building around. It can show up in the metagame, and the only question is, what ends up being the things that it finds hard to deal with? And I think that seems fairly straightforward to me. This is a deck that is playing a big 4-drop, a big 5-drop, and a big 6-drop. The things decks like that tend to struggle with, especially as they spread power across the board, are decks that are able to go extremely tall in 2 lanes and able to do that with a lot of power. Bounce decks tend to be good examples of this, targeting specific lanes with massive power and being willing to throw away other lanes. Decks even maybe like Surtur can actually have solid matchups here, again, because the deck that this card wants to go in is extremely telegraphed and extremely straightforward. You play Doom 2099, you play a 5-drop, and then you play Doctor Doom. That's it. And it's giving you so much free power for doing that tends to be worth doing. But it is straightforward, easy to understand, not necessarily easy to counter, but easy to know when you're going to win or lose, because it's not like there's a lot of surprise in what's actually happening here. Another thing that Doom 2099 is interestingly good at is being played early. So, for example, in an Arishem deck or with the card Zabu, the earlier you get this card out, the bigger it starts scaling. The earlier you can start creating these Doombot 2099s, the better it is for you. If you're able to Zabu this card out on 3, you get a full extra Doombot with a full extra buff applied to all of your Dooms. That's extremely powerful. So, in closing, I think Doom 2099 and the Doombots that it creates are going to be some of the strongest and most impactful cards in this season. And the only question is, are we going to be able to devise decks that attack 2 locations at a higher rate than this deck can attack 3? Next up is Bruce Banner, a 2/1 with an ability that reads, whenever you end a turn with unspent energy, you have a 25% chance to Hulk out. Now, if this seems a little bit vague to anyone, don't worry. It means he turns into the Hulk. So this could be a 2/12 if you get lucky enough. Now, the thing is, you only really have 4 turns in order with which to skip energy. You skip on 2, 3, 4. You can't skip on 2 because you're playing this on 2. So you skip on 3, 4, 5, and 6, which gives you approximately a 69% chance, if you play this guy on 2, at getting a 12 power guy. I'm not actually sure if that makes him a good enough unit. It seems a little weird to me because, obviously it is strong if it happens, but there's a very pronounced weakness that this card has, and that is the card Red Guardian. Playing a 2/12 is great. Skipping energy and then getting it blown out into being a 2-1 is not great. And I think that dynamic might do enough to hold this card down. It's not like we haven't had 2/12s in the metagame before, even. Thena, for example, is basically the same. Same dynamic, same asking you to do stuff, same really big cards, same weakness to Red Guardian, except there's not really RNG inherent in it. Her floor is a little bit higher because you're still just playing cards and they matter. She has synergy with a card like Agent Venom, right? Like, that actually is impactful to her. This card has no synergy with Agent Venom. And so when I look at this card, I see a scary card, a card that people are definitely going to make YouTube clips out of, a card that people are going to be upset about, but I'm not sure if I see a strong card. I obviously am in favor of releasing a card that hooks back into High Evolutionary. I'm a pretty big fan of High Evolutionary, and I think the deck needs the help. So I do hope that it is able to at least make the cut in that deck and be an important piece of what that deck is trying to do. In line with that, I really almost wish this card made a High Evo Hulk. Like, that would be, that would be cool. It might actually be too strong then, because then you're really skipping energy, and the delta is no longer, this is making a 2/12, but now this is making like a 2/18, a 2/20. That's actually just kind of impossible to beat. I think that would be the super pushed version of this card, and I understand why they wouldn't want to do that. That said, as someone who's wanted buffs to High Evolutionary for a while, this is the kind of card that could qualify as being a buff to High Evolutionary. I'm interested also in the fact that they are willing to make a Bruce Banner card and have the Hulk exist in the game. That seems like a pretty clear departure, and I've been noticing this departure a little bit, with Spider-Man, Symbiote Spider-Man, but I think they're clearly recognizing, like, hey, people want to play with the cool characters that they know from Marvel Comics, and not like, whatever mook we actually have access to that is not Bruce Banner in a Bruce Banner type season. I'm excited for what this represents, and also, I should say, this is some of the dopest base art I've seen on a card in a very long time. Finally, Peni Parker. Peni Parker is a weird card with a lot of moving parts, and there's no pun intended there, even though she is a mech pilot, effectively. Peni Parker has multiple things that she hooks into. First off, she is a 2/3, good on curve, that creates a card in your hand that is Spider the Mech, but it's like spelled SP//DR because it's like a future mech Evangelion ripoff kind of thing. The way that this card works is also that Penny is a merge lord. Whenever this card merges with anything, you get an extra energy. So Agony into Penny is interesting. Hulkbuster hooks in with this. There's some cool stuff that can happen when you're doing a card with as many hooks as this one has. But the reason this card has so many hooks is not just, oh, it's a 2/3 that creates a card and it hooks into merge lords. It also hooks into stuff with the card that it creates. Spider is a 3/3 that merges into something and gives it the ability to move one time, but only on the next turn. This means that it hooks additionally into something like Multiple Man. And I think Multiple Man is a great example of a card that uses a lot of the parts of the Buffalo here with Penny. Multiple Man wants to go with other cards that merge. Penny wants to go with other cards that merge. Multiple Man wants to be moved. Penny gives you the ability to move a card. And so I think when I look at things that want to go with this, I look at like move payoff type stuff. I look at like, maybe Human Torch, obviously, like that goes to 10 with the ability to have a free move. I look at Multiple Man, which wants to be played with all these merge cards anyway. I look at maybe this could be like a new style Phoenix Force deck. But mostly what I think of when I think of Penny is I'm actually a little bit surprised they created a card with so many disparate hooks in it. Like, look at Bruce for a second. He does one thing. He's a guy that turns into a bigger guy when you skip energy. He goes in one type of deck, and it's the kind of deck that is willing to skip energy. And then take a second and look at Penny. The range of outcomes is so huge here. She could go in a deck that just wants to play her as a 2/3 that creates a card. Like a Wiccan deck is really looking for a 2/3 that makes a 3. That's amazing, right? It totally wants that. But what about the other synergies that she has? Does she go in a Multiple Man deck? Probably. Does she go in a normal move deck? I don't know. Are you more interested in actually playing cards like Madam Web? Almost certainly in your normal move deck. So is this actually an upgrade in there? I don't know. Is this a Phoenix Force card? I don't know. The range of outcomes is so vast. I think on baseline, if Wiccan decks exist by the time this card comes out, a 2/3 that makes a 3 is the card they have been dreaming of forever. It wants that. Wiccan wants that. It'll just be like, worst case scenario, we have a Penny that merges with a Hulkbuster, or merges with this card, we get an extra energy, we do crazy stuff. At minimum, that goes in Wiccan decks. At minimum. But at maximum, this card could have like combo potential, unforeseen fusions with other merge cards, Agony, Hulkbuster. What does that mean? What about Symbiote Spider-Man? Does that go with this card? Do you want to get extra moves that way? What is exactly going on with all of the stuff this card hooks into? It's the most complex and most interesting card of the month by a lot, I think. And I think that's actually probably pretty good flavor. To have Peni Parker, who is ultimately, like, this is a very weird character. She is like an anime Spider-Man who has a mental bond with the spider that lives in her mech suit. The mech suit is actually piloted by the spider via her mental bond. They're like a symbiosis type thing, but don't get it confused because she's not a symbiote. It's a different thing. They just are friends. And it's a very weird character that has a lot of weird things going on with it. So I think this is actually like kind of a triumph of flavor. I gotta tell you, I'm probably more excited for this card than I am for anything else just because of like the vast implications of all the weird stuff it can do. But at baseline, this is a 2-drop that makes a 3-drop and cheats energy, and it goes in every Wiccan deck ever made. Last but most certainly not least, Rocket and Groot. Rocket and Groot is a very interesting card because, first of all, it plays or looks a little bit like a Jeff, but when I look at this card, what I actually see is Power Crept Nocturne. This is a card that has the ability to move and has a lot of power attached to it. Imagine you're playing against one of those decks that drops 4 cards in a location on the end of the game. A lot of bounce decks do this. You move it to that location, that's a 3/7. If you played any cards at the location that it's at, it's bigger. This is a movable, like 3/6, 3/7, and I think that card is pretty underrated. I haven't seen as much raving about this card as I have about plenty of the other cards that are happening in this season, but this is kind of a sneaky one for me. I'm not saying we're necessarily in the metagame where like good 3s are all that matters. We've been in that metagame before. I think we're definitely out of it right now with all of the synergy stuff happening with Agent Venom and Scar. So it's possible that this card doesn't necessarily find a home. But we have been in metagames before where a card like this would be immediately recognized as extremely strong. And if we ever go back into metagames like that, I think this could be a real powerhouse. I also think, and I know this is a bit of a cop-out, but this probably does end up becoming one of the better cards to play in Silver Surfer. The ability to move stuff around and effectively just be big. Surfer is often a deck that doesn't necessarily have the ability to contest multiple lanes. In as much as Surfer is still a deck, this can be the kind of card where you put it on one location alongside maybe one other 3-drop. This is a 3/7, that is a 3/2, both get buffed by Silver Surfer. That kind of stuff can really hold down a location on its own. And the ability to move really should not be underestimated. Surfer is one of the few decks that was actually still playing Nocturne after her nerf, and this card is bigger than that. And I think that that is how this card should be understood. If you are a deck that was interested in a 3/5 that moves, you're probably interested in this because when I look at it, what I see is a 3/5 or bigger that moves. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I am extremely excited for this season. I feel like there's a ton of really exciting cards, but I will say by far, the card I am most excited for is Peni Parker. It's not just because Evangelion is my favorite anime of all time. That's a little bit of it, but it's mostly because of how many different hooks she has and how little I know about what the community will actually be able to accomplish with her. When I look at a lot of the other cards in here, cards like Bruce or Rocket and Groot, I see cards that I get. I understand what they are. I understand what the general consensus is going to be. And I understand, like, basically what you're supposed to see when you see that card. When I look at Peni Parker, I see everything from Wiccan Staple to the core of some combo deck that I'm just not smart enough to figure out. And I think that that is just awesome. I think that the range of outcomes being that wide on a card is so cool. And I'm really excited to see what the community does with it. Obviously, I'm excited for this season as a whole, but honestly, I feel like almost half of my excitement is for Peni Parker alone. As always, I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. Let me know which of these cards you're most excited about in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.